By the mid-19th century, Great Britain stood as the solitary architect of a new world order. This was not merely a matter of political dominance, but a geological lottery won through the abundance of surface-level coal and iron ore. The transition from an agrarian economy to one of mechanized production created a feedback loop of capital and innovation. In the blackened valleys of Wales and the textile mills of Lancashire, the cottage industry was systematically dismantled, replaced by the centralized efficiency of the factory system. This economic engine allowed a small island nation to project power disproportionate to its size. However, this hegemony was inherently unstable. The technology that Britain exported, steam locomotives, Bessemer steel converters, and telegraphy, carried the seeds of its own competition. As British engineers laid rails across the continent, they were unwittingly constructing the infrastructure for future rivals. The monopoly on industrial violence and production could not be contained. The genie of steam was out of the bottle, and the rest of the world was watching with envious, calculating eyes. To the east, the fragmented states of the German Confederation began to coalesce, not through democratic fervor, but through the binding iron of the Zollverein customs union. Prussia understood that modern sovereignty required industrial autonomy. Under the guidance of Otto von Bismarck, the state fostered a symbiotic relationship with heavy industry. The Krupp family empire in Essen became the forge of the nation, producing steel of such quality that it rendered existing fortifications obsolete. Unlike the organic, haphazard growth of British industry, the German model was dirigiste, planned, scientifically managed, and inextricably linked to military utility. The railway network was designed not just for commerce, but for the rapid mobilization of armies. By the time the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors in 1871, it possessed the most potent industrial chemistry and metallurgy sectors in Europe. The balance of power had shifted. The continent now had a new industrial heart, beating with the rhythm of the pile driver. Across the Atlantic, the conclusion of the American Civil War released a torrent of pent-up industrial potential. The United States possessed a singular advantage, a continental landmass rich in every necessary resource, insulated from European strife by two oceans. The era of the robber barons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, was characterized by vertical integration on a scale previously imaginable. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad did more than connect coasts. It created a unified national market that dwarfed the fractured economies of Europe. American production methods emphasized standardization and interchangeable parts, the so-called American system of manufacturing. By the turn of the century, Pittsburgh alone was producing more steel than the entire British Empire. This was not merely growth, it was an eclipse. The United States was transforming from a raw material exporter into the world's premier industrial colossus, though its geopolitical ambitions remained for the moment largely dormant. The Russian Empire faced an existential crisis. Defeat in the Crimean War had exposed the technological backwardness of the Tsarist autocracy. In response, the state initiated a top-down forced industrialization, spearheaded by Finance Minister Sergei Witte. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 was the necessary precursor, freeing labor for the factories, yet the agrarian economy remained sluggish. Witte's masterstroke was the Trans-Siberian Railway, a spine of steel intended to bind the vast Eurasian landmass and project power into the Pacific. However, this modernization was built on a fragile foundation of French loans and peasant taxation. Russia was attempting to leap across centuries of development in mere decades. The result was a volatile hybrid, 19th century industrial capitalism grafted onto a medieval political structure. Factories sprang up in St. Petersburg and Moscow, creating a radicalized urban proletariat that would eventually threaten the very throne that had summoned them. In the Pacific, the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853 shattered Japan's isolation. Unlike China, which fractured under Western pressure, Japan executed a miraculous pivot. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was not merely a change of government, but a wholesale adoption of Western methodology to preserve Eastern sovereignty. The slogan, "Rich Country, Strong Army," became the national ethos. The samurai class was dissolved, their stipends pandorbited into government bonds to fund industrial zaibatsus like Mitsubishi. Japanese delegations traveled the world, copying the British Navy, the Prussian Army, and the American educational system. Within a single generation, Japan transitioned from a feudal society of rice farmers and swordsmen to an industrial power capable of building its own locomotives and battleships. This rapid metamorphosis stunned the West, proving that industrialization was not an exclusively Caucasian prerogative. Japan had awakened, and it was hungry for resources to feed its new machines. As industrial capacity exploded, the domestic supply of raw materials in Europe proved insufficient. The factory beasts needed to be fed. Rubber for tires and insulation, copper for telegraph wires, oil for lubrication, these became the new gold. This economic imperative drove the new imperialism, culminating in the Scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, European diplomats drew lines across a map of Africa, partitioning the continent with zero regard for ethnic or linguistic realities. It was a bureaucratic partition of the world, driven by the logic of the ledger. King Leopold II of Belgium turned the Congo into a private labor camp for rubber extraction, a grim testament to the human cost of industrial veracity. Empire was no longer just about prestige, it was a supply chain necessity. The industrial core in Europe was sustained by a periphery of extraction, locking the global south into a cycle of exploitation that fueled the smokestacks of the north. The ultimate expression of this industrial might was the Dreadnought, inspired by the theories of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued that sea power was the key to history. Nations poured their steel output into naval armaments. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 rendered every other battleship afloat obsolete overnight. It was a technological reset button that paradoxically hurt Britain's dominance, as it nullified their existing numerical advantage. A frantic naval arms race ensued, particularly between Britain and Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II, envious of the Royal Navy, directed Admiral von Tirpitz to build a fleet capable of challenging British hegemony. This was the most expensive arms race in history, consuming up to a third of national budgets. These floating fortresses were not just weapons, they were symbols of national virility and industrial competence. Every rivet drove the great powers closer to bankruptcy and closer to the realization that these expensive toys would eventually have to be used. By 1914, the industrial machine had created a world of rigid timetables and interlocking alliances. The mobilization of millions of men was no longer a matter of marching drums, but of railway logistics and algorithmic precision. The Schlieffen Plan and similar strategies relied on the speed of trains and the volume of shells. War had become an industrial process, a mathematical certainty, where once the start button was pressed, it could not be stopped. The diplomatic flexibility of the 19th century had calcified into a brittle system of treaties, enforced by the terrifying power of modern ballistics. When the Archduke fell in Sarajevo, it was not merely a political assassination. It was the spark in a powder magazine that had been diligently stocked by 50 years of industrial acceleration. The factories, the railways, the shipyards, they had all been built for this moment. The industrial world did not sleepwalk into war. It had built the very conveyor belt that carried it there.